So today I'm joined by somebody whose resume is what I would call very heavy. He's an author, he's a speaker, pastor, counselor, and so much more. He's a New York Times best-selling author, selling over 20 million copies of the very popular book, The Five Love Languages. Please join me and welcome Dr. Gary Chapman. So good to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Belinda. It's great to be with you.
So before we jump into our conversation, let me ask you, 2023 is here. It feels like time is just flying by. How has your year been so far? And is there any kind of experiences that you'd like to share with us before we jump into what we're here to talk about today?
Well, it's been a busy year for me. I officially retired from the church where I have served for 50 years. Same church, but they let me keep my office. They let me keep my assistant. So if I'm in town, I'm here every day, still helping people. Love what I do, but I'm free to travel more. So it's exciting time in my life. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, congratulations on retirement and 50 years. Wow.
My wife says she doesn't know how that could be possible because she says she's only 49 herself. So
I love her humor. So we're going to be talking a bit about the fact that you've got time to travel now because you'll be coming here into the UK. But before we jump into that, if we could just take a step back to the book, The Five Love Languages. And I'm curious because I read this a long time ago. I'm curious about what it was that inspired you to write the book and where you even came up with the concept of the five love languages.
It actually grew out of my counseling. They would sit in my office and one of them would say, I just don't feel any love coming from him or her. And the other would say, I don't understand that. I do this and this and this and this and this. I don't know why you wouldn't feel love. And I realized that people were sincere. In their mind, they were loving the other person, but it wasn't connecting emotionally with them. And so after a number of years, I thought, there's got to be a pattern to this. So I thought, I'm going to read my notes. And I went back through several years of notes that I made when I was counseling and asked myself the question, when someone said, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want? What were they complaining about? And their answers fell into five categories. And I started calling them the five love languages. And so I started using that in my counseling, that if you want her to feel love, you've got to learn how to express love in her love language. And if you want him to feel love, you've got to learn his love language. And I would help couples discover each other's language, challenge them to go home and try it. And sometimes, Belinda, they would come back in 3 weeks and say, Gary, this is changing everything. The whole climate is different now between us. And then I started using it in small groups of couples, and the same thing would happen. Probably 5 years later, I thought, if I could put this concept in a book and write it in the language of the common person, leave out psychological jargon that people wouldn't understand, maybe I could help a lot of couples that I would never have time to see in my office. Little did I know, as you said, the book is sold now over 20 million copies. It's been translated in over 50 languages around the world, which really surprised me. But that's the history. That's the background. It's been out 30 years now. It was published in 92, and every year it sells more than the year before. And that doesn't happen to books typically.
That's absolutely remarkable. And for those who don't know, I think I've got this right. I jotted them down. I'm thinking, do I know them? Because I know what my one is now. So it's words of affirmation, acts of service, receiving gifts, quality time, and physical touch, right?
You got it, girl.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Chapman, for joining us here on Premier today. I wanted to know from you, out of the five love languages, would you say in a relationship there's one that's more crucial or dominant in a relationship, or are they equally as important?
They're pretty equally distributed among the population, and they are not gender specific. The husband can have any one of the five as his primary. She can have any one of the five. I do think that there's some husbands who they just hear the concept and they immediately say, oh, my love language is physical touch. But they're thinking about the sexual part of marriage. And I say, well, maybe that is your language, but do non-sexual touches make you feel loved? Mm-hmm. And they look at me like a deer in the headlights. Are there non-sexual touches? I say, well, listen, Let's say you get out of the car, you're walking into a shopping mall, and she reaches over and holds your hand. Does that make you feel loved? And if he says, that kind of irritates me. I said, okay. So she's pouring you a cup of coffee and she puts her hand on your shoulder. Does that make you feel loved? And if he says, no, not really. Well, then I said, physical touch is not your language, okay? So no, don't assume that that's true of all men. These are equally divided among males and females, and the five are pretty much. If there was one that's a little bit less, it is receiving gifts. Though all of us like to receive gifts, but as far as being the primary love language, it's probably the lower on the scale.
Right. Brilliant. Well, that's a good one to know. So you mentioned that they're not necessarily gender specific. In your time and in your research, have you seen any kind of cultural differences? Maybe some cultures lean towards one more than the other, or would you, again, you say it's equally dispersed?
I don't have any hard research on that. And I'm gonna be honest, this is what surprised me most, is that it was taken to other cultures. Because my academic background is cultural anthropology. Before I studied counseling, I did a bachelor's and a master's in cultural anthropology, studying cultures all over the world. And I understand cultural differences. And when the first publisher came, which happened to be Spanish, asking for permission to publish it in Spanish, I said to my publisher, I said, I don't know if this works in Spanish culture. And they said, well, they've read the book and they want to publish it. I said, well, okay. It became their bestseller. I mean, I forget how many million they sold. So that really did surprise me with my background. So it does seem to me now that these five are pretty fundamental to human nature. Now, the dialects in which you speak these languages will certainly be colored by the culture. For example, as you know, there are cultures where you greet a friend, you kiss them on one cheek and kiss them on the other cheek. In my culture, we don't do that. We shake hands. You know, at least if we don't have COVID, we shake hands. So that what I call dialects, that is the various manners in which you speak these languages, are going to differ from culture to culture. But I don't know that one is more predominant in a culture, than another culture. In that sense, maybe those cultures that practice kissing on both cheeks, maybe physical touch is more common for them. Right. I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned slightly a little bit earlier on, or briefly a little bit earlier on what some gifts of service might look like in terms of somebody making you a cup of tea and then the physical touch with them, maybe putting their hand on your hand. How does one identify what their love language is? Because we can't all have a sit down with you personally. So how does one identify what their love language is and then go on to communicate that to their partners?
Well, let me give you 3 clues. 1, observe your own behavior. How do you most naturally respond to other people? If you're always giving other people encouraging words, then words of affirmation is likely your language, because we tend to speak our own language if we don't understand the concept. And so if you, for example, are always, patting people on the back or giving high fives, or, then physical touch is probably your language, because that's what you're doing to other people. So how do you typically respond to other people? Second question is this: what do you complain about most often? The complaint reveals the love language. The wife who says, I just feel like we don't have any time together anymore. I feel like we're ships just passing in the night. She's complaining that she's not getting quality time. They don't sit down and talk. She doesn't know what's going on inside of him anymore. So she's complaining. I had a mother say to me recently, she said, my 6-year-old son said to me, we don't ever go to the park anymore since the baby came. He used to have his mother's quality time. He and his mother just together in the park. He's not getting it, and he's complaining about it. So what do you complain about? If your spouse goes on a business trip and come home and you say, you didn't bring me anything? They're telling you gifts is their language. And then the other question is this: what do you request most often? The request reveals the love language. If you're going on a business trip and your spouse says, be sure and bring me a surprise, they're telling you up front, my language is quality, is physical, it's gifts. Or if you are requesting your spouse, honey, could you take the trash out, or could you do this, or could you do that, or could you? you're asking for them to do things for you, then acts of service is probably your language. Now, it's not always true that what you speak most frequently is your language, but these other two questions with that first one will pretty much help you figure it out. Now, as you may know, there is a free quiz online at 5lovelanguages.com, the number 5lovelanguages.com. There's a quiz for married couples, there's a quiz for single adults, there's a quiz for teenagers. And you simply ask several questions, make choices between two things, and it tells you what your primary love language is, what your secondary love language is, and how the others fall in line under that.
Absolutely brilliant. Dr. Gary Chapman, author of New York Times best-selling book, The 5 Love Languages, joining us today on Premiere. Now, I have another question for you. So we've been talking about the love languages and how they can help us. When you're in a relationship for a good amount of time, and we evolve as people as well, over that course of that time, is it possible that our love language could change? And if so, how does one adapt?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the primary love language tends to stay with us for a lifetime, like a lot of other personality traits. But having said that, yes, I think there are seasons of life and circumstances where another love language may jump to the top. For example, a mother who has 2 preschool children. Acts of service may not have been her primary language, but during those years, it's probably going to jump to the top because she's overwhelmed with so many things to do. Or just a situation like maybe your spouse is on the phone, they receive information that a family member has died, and they start crying. Well, physical touch may not be their primary language, but for you to reach up and put your arms around them and hold them while they cry is probably the most powerful thing you could do at that moment. So I think, yes, there are situations. I think another common factor is if number 1 and number 2 are rather close, and sometimes they are, if you get enough of number 1, you may begin to feel, I don't know, I think number 2 has become number 1. But if they stop doing number 1, you'll quickly say, oh, no, that's still my primary.
Amazing. So a question for you. I came across your book or the concept of the 5 love languages actually on the job. So I just started at a new company. And as part of the culture training, where we was kind of getting to know what the ethos of the company was about and just understanding, the vision of the company. One of the things they asked was, what's your love language? And I remember us sitting in a room and us being like, huh? Why are we talking about love? We're just trying to work and get paid. But it was something that they kind of broke down and we went away and kind of researched it. And that was where I came across the whole concept of love languages in the first place. So have you found that people are using it outside of, couples relationships as well, maybe in the corporate world?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we published a book taking the love languages to work, but we call it the 5 languages of appreciation in the workplace. We use the word appreciation rather than love. And the reason that motivated us to write that, I wrote it with a psychologist who's had 20 years experience with business leaders, is that in our country, 70% of the people who have a job say they feel little to no appreciation coming from the people with whom they work. And 64% of the people who leave a job and go to another job say they left primarily because they didn't feel appreciated where they were. So that motivated me to team up with Dr. Paul White. And he did some research going into a business, giving them a job satisfaction test, then explaining the appreciation languages and letting everybody take the quiz. There's a code that comes with the book that gives you a free quiz. We call it the MBA inventory, Motivating by Appreciation Inventory. And it gives you your primary, your secondary, and the one that's least important to you. Then everybody in the group gets all that information so that if you want to express appreciation, you now know what would be most meaningful to that person. And then he would go back in 2 years and give another job satisfaction test. In every case, it was statistically improved. So yeah, we think this has the potential of creating a much more positive climate in the workplace.
Brilliant. And one of the things I really love about it is I think it gives us as individuals times to really figure out who we are. Oftentimes we just live We just get on with stuff,
Yeah.
and we're blessed enough, I suppose, that we have, people around us who just accept us as we are. But I think that what I really loved about the book and the concept is that it forced me to sit down and think about, what do I actually like? What do I
Yeah.
really appreciate? And it's benefited, I find, all my relationships, like friendships with my parents, with my siblings and everything. So that's fantastic. So the book's been out for over 30 years now.
Yeah.
Have you encountered any new love languages or refined the 5 that are there? Anything new happened that you've come across in your research?
Well, I've had people suggest a sixth love language. Many things. One is chocolate, chocolate, and I say, well, if they bought it, it's a gift. If they made it, it's an act of service. And I've had people say, the sixth love language is tacos. Well, again, if they bought a taco and gave it to you, it's a gift. If they made a taco, it's an act of service. So I've heard a lot of things like that. Most of them humorous, and I'm open. But to this point, I have not heard or discovered myself anything that I would consider to be a sixth love language. I've always been open. I wasn't dogmatic when I wrote the book. These were just the 5 that I discovered, in my counseling over a number of years.
Mm.
But I'm a little more convinced now that these 5 are pretty the fundamental. And if there's a 6, I'm still open. Okay.
Were there any biblical principles that inspired or helped you to shape the love languages?
Every one of these love languages is illustrated in the scriptures, every one of them, which kind of leads me to say anything you discover in social research, if it's true, you'll find it illustrated in the Bible. Mm. And the people have asked me along the way, what is God's love language? So I did a study just looking for God's love language, and I found out he speaks all 5 fluently, really fluently, Old Testament and New Testament. So I wrote a book called God Speaks Your Love Language, in which I talk about how for many people, their sense of God in the first place, when they responded to God, if they did respond to him, it was in their love language because God spoke their love language. Just like Saul, for example, on the road to Damascus, God touched him physically. He fell off the horse. He was blinded. God got his attention because he loved him and he had something for him to do. So there is a correlation between how we come to Christ and our love language. And the other thing I discovered is that once we become believers, we tend to express our love to God most naturally in our own love language. So if words is our language, we just give God words of thanks and praise. And, we're words people. Physical touch people, these are the people that are most freely lift their hands when they're worshiping and singing. They get on their knees when they pray. I mean, the body's involved, It's a very, very fascinating correlation there. But at any rate, I think there's full biblical evidence that God speaks all these love languages. We're made in God's image. And even though every one of these are fine, and none of us are going to turn these away, any one of them. Yeah. But if we don't get our primary love language, we likely will not feel loved, even though the person may be speaking some of the other languages.
Amen to that. Thank you so much for sharing. So you mentioned that you've retired now, but your work is not yet over because you're about to go on this tour. As part of that tour, you're going to be here in the UK. So can you tell us a bit about what's going to be taking place? What can people expect and where can they find you?
I'm going to be speaking in 2 or 3 or 4 different churches.
And do you know if the focus is going to be kind of around the love languages, or are there other topics that you'll be looking at as well?
Well, I'm going to do some evening sessions, and some of the churches will have 2 sessions, which I call the 2 essentials of long-term healthy marriages or any relationship. And one is that we meet each other's need for love, and that's where I will share the 5 love languages. But the second session is on dealing effectively with our failures, and that involves apologizing and forgiving. And what we discovered is not only do people have a love language, they have an apology language. We have different ideas on what a sincere apology looks like. We were taught to apologize, hopefully, by our parents, but we had different parents. So we grew up with different ideas on what it means to apologize. So that helps people understand what they consider to be a sincere apology, discuss it with the other person so that now they know how to apologize to each other. And then we talk about excuse me, then we talk about forgiveness. What forgiveness is, what forgiveness does, what forgiveness does not do. So I believe if you get these two things going in a positive direction in your life, you'll have a long-term healthy relationship, because none of us are perfect. You don't have to be perfect to have a good relationship, but we do have to deal with our failures. They don't go away. When we fail each other, we hurt each other, it creates an emotional barrier. It's like a block in a wall between us. And it doesn't go away with the passing of time. We have to deal with it. And that involves apologizing for it and the other person choosing to forgive us. So, yeah, those are the two things we'll be speaking in the evening sessions at the churches where we are.
Wow, I feel like I need to come to one of those sessions. It sounds like it's going to be extremely powerful. Dr. Chapman, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I will let you go. But if I could hold on to you for the rest of the day, I really would. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so, so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Belinda. It was good to be with you.